When Geoffrey Tarne handed Vincent Arlo a boarding pass and smiled at the corner of his mouth, it was not the smile of a man sending a colleague to succeed. To Geoffrey Tarne, Vincent Arlo was a floor 7 inconvenience, technically useful, perpetually underutilized, the sort of man whose name appeared on every critical technical document and on no guest list that mattered. Sending him to Singapore was not a decision Geoffrey had made with any expectation of a deal being saved. It was a decision made with the quiet architecture of someone who needed a name attached to a failure before the failure arrived. What Geoffrey Tarne did not know, and what Vincent Arlo had never once seen fit to mention, was that the load distribution framework, sitting beneath more than $2 billion worth of energy infrastructure for contracts across the Asia-Pacific, had been designed in a spare bedroom in Hamilton, Ontario, 9 years earlier by a man who had been too focused on getting the math right to consider who would get the credit. In a glass boardroom 37 floors above Marina Bay, a man named Kenneth Wolfe was going to make that clear to everyone in the room. Pallister Infrastructure Group occupied 12 floors of a tower on 9th Avenue in Calgary. Vincent had worked there for 8 years as a senior systems analyst, a title that sounded important on a business card and meant almost nothing at the executive level, where the people who needed his answers rarely remembered his name between one request and the next. He worked on the 7th floor. The 7th floor had no view of the mountains. It had a window that looked onto the roof of the parking structure next door, a coffee machine perpetually out of dark roast, and the particular quiet of a place where serious work gets done by people nobody is watching. He had come to Calgary after his wife Elise died of a brain aneurysm 3 days after their 15th anniversary. That was 6 years ago. His daughter, Faye Arlo, was 13 then. She was 19 now and in her first year at Dalhousie, studying marine biology, calling every Sunday evening from Halifax with the same directness her mother had possessed and a laugh that arrived without warning and sounded exactly right. Vincent wore the same 4 button-down shirts in rotation, kept a small photograph of Elise and Faye on the corner of his desk beside a ceramic mug, and carried in his jacket pocket a folded note Faye had left in his luggage the last time he visited. He had not read it again since the day he found it. He did not need to, he had it memorized. That autumn, the entire company had been orbiting a single transaction. Pallister Infrastructure wanted a joint development agreement with Wolfe Pacific Capital, a shared build of a renewable energy distribution network anchored in Singapore and extending across 4 countries in Southeast Asia. The headline value was $900 million. The internal projections leaned on it, with the full weight of the next 3 fiscal years. Every conversation at the executive level bent toward it eventually. Every quarterly update referenced it. And for 4 months, the deal had gone nowhere. On a Tuesday in late October, Vincent was called up to the 31st floor to present a technical annex he had been asked to produce 3 weeks earlier. The request had been casual, something about verifying the engineering assumptions in the capacity model. What nobody upstairs had anticipated was that Vincent would spend those 3 weeks not verifying the assumptions but auditing the entire proposal from the load forecasts up. What he found was not a rough edge. He found 3 separate structural failures, each sufficient on its own to end the negotiation, and all 3 pointing in the same direction. He printed the analysis, organized it into tabbed sections, and rode the elevator up with the folder under his arm and the particular steadiness of a man who has decided to say something difficult and has run out of reasons to delay. The boardroom on 31 had a long oval table, floor-to-ceiling glass, and a view of the Bow River going silver in the October light. 11 people sat around it. Geoffrey Tarne sat at the near end. 52 years old, former investment banking, brought in 3 years ago to manage growth and acquisition, wearing the kind of suit that arrived in a dedicated box and never quite looked worn in. He was genuinely intelligent. Vincent had never confused resentment with honest assessment. The problem was not Geoffrey Tarne's intelligence. The problem was the specific way he used it. Always toward the question of who was winning, and never toward the question of whether the thing being won was real. Vincent presented for 11 minutes. The first failure was capacity. The proposal committed Pallister to a network throughput, sustained energy delivery across the four-country footprint that their infrastructure had never once demonstrated under real operating conditions. The gap between committed and demonstrated was approximately 22%, not fraud necessarily. Optimism accumulated across 3 departments, each team accepting the number from the one above it, nobody going back to the source. But if Wolf Pacific signed the agreement on those terms, the network would perform adequately for perhaps 18 months and begin to fail during peak seasonal demand. The reputational damage would land on both names equally. The second failure was the exclusivity structure. The agreement bound Wolf Pacific to Pallister's systems architecture for 10 years, with exit penalties calibrated to make leaving more expensive than staying with a degrading network. Meanwhile, Pallister's performance obligations carried almost no enforceability, no service credits with real teeth, no escalating remedies tied to impact. He said plainly that no counterparty with competent legal counsel would sign it, and that the length of the term was not confidence in the technology. It was insurance against doubt in the technology. The third failure was the load modeling. The entire capital plan had been built on a demand forecast derived from North American grid data, quarterly weighted, tuned to the seasonal behavior of a consumer electricity market. It had been applied to Southeast Asia with a currency conversion and nothing else. No adjustment for monsoon season consumption patterns. No modeling for regional regulatory cycles that shifted load timing across borders. No accounting for the difference between a market built around household consumption and one built around industrial transshipment and export processing. Every number downstream of that model carried the error forward and amplified it. He said that if this version of the proposal was submitted, Wolf Pacific would decline it. He said the decline would come quickly, because the people on their side who reviewed such things were careful. Geoffrey Tarne let the room stay quiet for a moment. Then he asked, with a pleasantness that was worse than open hostility, whether Vincent had been given the brief for a full contractual review or for a technical annex on load assumptions. One of the senior vice presidents laughed. A second looked at the table. Geoffrey said that commercial agreements of this scale required a particular kind of judgment. The kind that came from understanding how large organizations made decisions, what they valued, how they weighed risk against opportunity. He said it with the serene confidence of someone who had decided the room agreed with him before he finished the sentence. Vincent closed his folder and said nothing more. He rode the elevator back to the 7th floor and spent the rest of the afternoon on grid compliance reviews. And at 5:15 he called Faye, who was between classes, and listened to her describe a professor she found impenetrable for 14 uninterrupted minutes. At 6:40 that evening, the message arrived from Singapore. Wolf Pacific Capital was declining the current structure of the proposal. Their stated objections were 3: overcommitted network capacity, unbalanced exclusivity terms, and load modeling inappropriate to the regional operating environment. Vincent did not feel vindicated. He had been in enough organizations to know what happened when a prediction came true in front of people who had dismissed it. Somewhere, before he reached his office the next morning, a story would begin to be assembled, and the story would need a face to put on the failure. He was summoned back to 31 at 7:30. The room had thinned to Geoffrey Tarne, 2 senior vice presidents, and a lawyer who did not introduce himself. Geoffrey studied Vincent for a long moment, and then said the situation required someone who understood the technical architecture well enough to speak credibly on site. that the Singapore team had already arranged introductions, that flights had been booked for the following morning. Vincent could not amend a single clause of the term sheet. He could not commit to anything on behalf of the company, verbally or in writing. No legal representation from Pallister would travel with him. His name did not appear on the official negotiating delegation. He requested, in a follow-up email sent carefully through the compliance channel, a limited technical mandate in writing. The response said the matter was under review and would be revisited upon his return. Upon his return from a 3-day rescue mission for a deal he had no authority to restructure. He went home and packed a suitcase that had last been used for a professional conference 2 years before Elise's funeral. Faye called while he was folding shirts. She had a habit, inherited precisely from her mother, of hearing something off in the background of a conversation and going directly toward it. She asked whether something had happened at work. He told her yes, and then he told her the shape of it plainly, that sometimes an organization constructed a situation in which one person could absorb a failure that properly belonged to other people, and that this appeared to be one of those situations. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Don't let them do that." Not as a question, not as reassurance, as a statement of what she expected. Something in Vincent's chest went very still, because he had been quietly preparing to do exactly that. To take the trip, perform as well as possible within the constraints given, and accept whatever followed as the cost of institutional belonging. Faye, in 7 words, had identified precisely what was wrong with that plan. Singapore arrived the way places do when you have not slept well on the flight and are not certain what you are walking toward. The air was dense even in the shadow of the terminal. The expressway into the city ran between construction projects that suggested a place permanently in the act of becoming something larger than itself. Black cars idled at the hotel entrance with the efficiency of a city that understood logistics and expected everyone else to as well. Vincent's room was on the 14th floor. Curtis Bain and Anita Raj, Senior Vice President and Vice President respectively, both of whom had flown business class on a separate itinerary, Vincent had not been informed of, were in suites 2 floors above, with a scheduling contact at Wolf Pacific and a dinner reservation Vincent learned about from a confirmation briefly visible on Curtis Bain's phone screen before the screen turned away. He unpacked, reviewed his folder, and slept 4 hours. The Wolf Pacific offices occupied the upper section of a tower facing the bay. The boardroom had a long stone table and a skyline visible through floor-to-ceiling glass like a second agenda laid across the room. Vincent arrived early and set technical summary documents at every chair before anyone else had entered. It was not a calculated gesture. It was simply what he did when he had useful information and a table to put it on. Curtis Bain arrived at the same moment and watched him distribute the last of the folders. Then he said quietly, in the tone of a man who believed he was being generous, "Vincent, don't misread the invitation. Being in the room isn't the same as being at the table." Vincent told him he had never once misread it, which was the truth. Curtis seemed satisfied by that, which told Vincent everything he needed to know about Curtis Bain. The session opened without Kenneth Wolf. A deputy director chaired the first 40 minutes, flanked by 2 infrastructure engineers and a woman from their strategic partnerships group who took notes in a leather journal with a fountain pen. Curtis Bain presented. Anita Raj supported. Within 6 minutes, Vincent heard the network capacity figures read aloud in that room. Unchanged, uncorrected, delivered with full confidence to the people who had already declined them in writing. The 22% overcommitment was still in the document. The 10-year exclusivity clause was still there. The North American load model sat underneath the Southeast Asian forecast like a stone under carpet. He understood, sitting in his chair at the far end of the table, with a glass of water he had not touched, the full architecture of what he had been sent to do. A COO who genuinely intended to fix the proposal would have sent lawyers and a mandate. Geoffrey Tarne had sent an analyst with no authority and a resubmission of a rejected document, which meant he had not expected success. He had expected a second refusal, and a second refusal now had a name attached to it. The file had been building while Vincent was packing. He was still holding that thought when the door at the far end of the room opened, and the quality of attention in the room shifted the way it shifts before weather. Kenneth Wolfe was 63 years old, silver-haired, jacket open, nothing in his hands. He had built 3 port logistics networks and a renewable energy fund operating across 11 countries. He moved through rooms the way men do when they have spent decades making decisions that outlasted the rooms in which they made them. Unhurried, absorbing everything, giving away nothing. His eyes moved along the faces at the table with the neutral efficiency of a man who has been introduced to a great many people and retains the ones who mattered. Then his gaze reached the end of the table and stopped. He did not greet Curtis Bain. He did not acknowledge Anita Raj, whose hand was already extended. He walked the full length of the stone table without speaking to anyone, stopped in front of Vincent's chair, and looked at him for a moment that felt considerably longer than it was. Something shifted in his expression. Vincent Arlo. Vincent stood. His own voice came out steadier than he had expected. He said good morning, and they shook hands. Not the handshake of a counterparty meeting a vendor, but the handshake of 2 people who had once spent 3 days and 2 nights in the same room while something large came apart around them and had not spoken since. Kenneth Wolfe asked where in the world Vincent had gone. Vincent told him that life had rearranged itself some years back, that he had made certain choices about staying close to home, and that he had been doing work that mattered even when nobody above a particular altitude had occasion to notice it. Curtis Bain moved in fast. "Mr. Wolfe," he said, "Vincent is part of our technical support function. He's here in an advisory capacity on systems questions." Kenneth Wolfe turned his head slowly toward Curtis. Then he leaned forward and read the small printed card sitting in front of Vincent's chair. He read it twice. Senior Systems Analyst, Technical Advisory, Non-Executive. He laughed, not warmly. The laugh of a man who has been handed information that does not reconcile with what he knows to be true, and who has not yet decided what to do with the people who handed it to him. He pulled the empty chair beside his own away from the table and said one word, "Sit." Nobody moved for 3 full seconds. Then Vincent Arlo picked up his folder and walked the length of the room in front of every executive who had watched him distribute documents that morning, and sat down beside the founder of Wolfe Pacific Capital at the head of the table. Anita Raj's expression did not change. Curtis Bain's face went the color of old paper. Kenneth poured Vincent water without being asked. In that room at that table, it was not a courtesy. It was a sentence with no punctuation left to add. He asked whether Vincent remembered the Midland Corridor project, a renewable energy node on the southern Ontario grid 12 years earlier that had come within hours of collapsing the distribution cascade across 3 provinces during a January ice storm. Vincent said he remembered it. The failure point was in the secondary load balancing loop. Every upstream component had tested clean, which was why it had taken almost 4 months to locate. Kenneth brought his hand flat down on the table and said that he had been on the phone with 4 engineers through 16 consecutive hours that night, and only one of them had known to look in the secondary loop. He turned to face the Pallister delegation. His voice settled into something flatter and more deliberate. "You will all know the Arlo framework," he said. Of course they did. Every infrastructure engineer in that room had encountered it in some form, a distributed load architecture for variable source energy networks, separating committed baseline delivery from elastic capacity, building in regional calibration cycles, carrying performance risk proportionally across a joint network. It was taught in graduate engineering programs, embedded in the operating standards of 2 national grid operators, cited in policy documents across the Asia-Pacific. Curtis Bain nodded reflexively, the way you nod at foundational knowledge, barely registering it as information at all. Kenneth let 2 full seconds pass. The man who designed it is sitting at this table. Does your COO know who you are? Vincent looked down at the folder in front of him, the one with the inflated capacity figures on page 7, and gave the only honest answer he had. I think he knows my floor number. Kenneth held his gaze for a moment. Then he reached forward, closed the bound proposal sitting in front of him, the document representing $900 million and 4 months of stalled negotiation, and slid it 8 inches away across the stone. I don't want to hear this presentation, he said. He looked at Vincent. I want to hear him. Vincent put both hands flat on the table. He said, Kenneth, I have to be completely clear with you, and with everyone in this room. I hold no mandate from Pallister Infrastructure to modify this agreement. I cannot alter pricing, terms, or scope. Anything I say is technical opinion. It does not bind the company. Curtis exhaled audibly. Kenneth studied him for a moment and then nodded slowly, the nod of a man who had always valued people who told him the limits of their authority before they told him anything else. Understood, he said. Then answer me a hypothetical. If you had the authority, what would you change? Vincent stood up and walked to the screen at the end of the room. He had no prepared slides. He had 11 days of work in his head and a folder of annotated notes under his arm, and for the next 52 minutes, he took that proposal apart in front of the people who had built it. He started with capacity, because capacity is where every infrastructure agreement eventually dies. Pallister's proposal committed to a sustained network throughput. Their systems had never once achieved under real operating conditions, outside a controlled simulation, approximately 22% above their demonstrated performance ceiling. Not deliberate misrepresentation. Optimism compounded across 3 internal departments until no single team owned the aggregate error. But if Wolf Pacific signed on those numbers, the network would function adequately for perhaps 18 months before beginning to degrade during peak seasonal demand cycles. The reputational damage would fall on both names equally. He moved to exclusivity, the 10-year lock-in with exit penalties that made departure more expensive than maintaining a failing network, while Pallister carried almost no corresponding performance liability, was not confidence in the technology. It was insurance against uncertainty about the technology. No counterparty with sound legal counsel would ever sign it. He moved to the load model. The forecast underlying the entire capital plan was derived from North American grid consumption data and applied to a 4-country Southeast Asian footprint without adjustment for monsoon season load shifts, for industrial transshipment cycles that drove consumption patterns entirely differently than residential demand, or for the regulatory timing differences affecting grid availability across borders. Every projection downstream of that model rested on an assumption that had no business in the document. Then he gave them the alternative, because criticism without construction is noise. And he had never once brought a problem to Kenneth Wolf without arriving at the shape of a solution. A 2-tier architecture, a committed baseline network sized to demonstrated capacity, with enforced performance guarantees binding on both sides, and an elastic secondary tier priced on actual utilization that could scale in 24-month increments as real regional data accumulated. Exclusivity reduced to 5 years and tied to specific performance thresholds rather than to elapsed time. Load modeling rebuilt entirely on regional inputs with a formal recalibration cycle every 18 months. That isn't the Arlo framework, Kenneth said when Vincent finished. That's what it's become. Vincent told him the truth, that he had kept developing it in the evenings over the years, because he could not stop thinking about the problem even when nobody was paying him to. He had simply never had a network large enough to test the later iterations on. Kenneth Wolfe was quiet for a moment. Then he told the room that Wolfe Pacific Capital was not withdrawing from the negotiation. He watched Curtis Bain and Anita Raj both exhale at the same instant, two people who had just been handed their careers back, with one condition. Vincent Arlo, Kenneth said, sits on the Joint Technical Design Committee and holds technical veto over the final network architecture. If he says the system cannot carry it, the system does not carry it. No one at your organization overrides that. Curtis Bain said carefully that such an arrangement would require review at the senior executive level. Kenneth Wolfe smiled. It did not reach his eyes. Then review it, he said. I have considerable patience and $900 million. You appear to have neither. They called Calgary from the corridor before Vincent had finished repacking his folder. He could hear one side of the conversation through the glass. Curtis Bain's voice pitched into the flat, urgent register of a man delivering news he knows will land badly. The offer from Geoffrey Tarne arrived 3 hours later, made in the tone of a man who had already framed it as generosity in his own mind. A promotion to Director of Network Strategy, effective on return. A salary adjustment that was 3.5 times his current base. A completion bonus tied to the close of the Wolfe Pacific Agreement. The words used were precise and fluent, and carefully arranged. The conditions arrived at the end, folded in where conditions always go, when conditions are the point. Geoffrey would resume direct oversight of all Wolfe Pacific negotiations. Vincent would support rather than lead, and the internal record concerning the technical review submitted prior to the original proposal, the one identifying all 3 structural failures before the document was ever transmitted, would not be raised in any forum going forward. He would not note, in writing or otherwise, that the review had been submitted, received, logged, and set aside, or that the response from the COO's office had directed that its contents be excluded from board materials. Vincent stood at the window of his hotel room, watching the city lights spread across the water. He understood exactly what he was being offered. It was not a promotion. It was a retainer on silence, structured as a promotion so that both of them could proceed without naming what it was. If he accepted, he would spend the remainder of his career as a man who had been bought once, which means a man who can be bought again. He thought about 7 words said by a 19-year-old from a residence hall in Halifax. He said no. He said it without any speech attached, because speeches are what people produce when they are not yet fully decided. His system credentials were suspended before 6 o'clock the next morning. The human resources message arrived 18 minutes later. 3 careful paragraphs. Conduct potentially inconsistent with delegated authority in an international commercial context. Advised to refrain from representing the company in any capacity. Next steps to follow. The word termination did not appear. It did not need to. Curtis Bain met him in the lobby of the Wolfe Pacific Tower at 10 to 9 and said, without quite making eye contact, that under the circumstances his participation in the day's sessions would no longer be appropriate. He said circumstances in the way people refer to weather, as though it were a condition that had arrived from outside and could not be attributed to anyone in particular. Vincent asked whether Curtis planned to inform Kenneth Wolfe that the person Kenneth had specifically requested was being removed overnight. Curtis said appropriate arrangements would be handled at the correct level. Vincent went back to the hotel. He did not call Kenneth Wolfe. That mattered to him then, and it matters now, because the story would have become something smaller and different if he had. He had known Kenneth Wolfe across 2 conversations and 1 shared crisis from a decade ago, and that is not a relationship you spend on your own rescue. He sat at the desk by the window and wrote a chronology in the flat, unemotional language of someone who has spent years writing incident reports and understands that documents outlast the feelings that produce them. And while he wrote, He remembered something Geoffrey Tarne had forgotten. 11 days before the original proposal was submitted, Vincent had not simply raised his concerns in a meeting. He had filed a formal technical risk assessment through Pallister's compliance channel, as the company's own governance manual required for any material discrepancy in a client-facing performance commitment. That document carried a system timestamp. It carried read receipts from 3 recipients, including 2 officers. It had been logged as received and open by the compliance officer, and appended to the thread, in writing, was a direction from the Office of the Chief Operating Officer, stating that the observations contained in the assessment were not to be incorporated into materials prepared for the board. Under Pallister's governance structure, any compliance filing classified as material with an unresolved status was automatically mirrored into the Audit Committee's secure repository. It had been sitting there for weeks, in a system Geoffrey Tarne did not control and could not quietly amend, waiting for someone to have a reason to look. Meanwhile, 7 floors above the bay, Kenneth Wolfe had developed a concern of his own. His lead analyst, working late and reconciling Vincent's presentation against the submitted proposal, had found something that stopped her entirely. The sustained throughput figure in the formal proposal delivered to Wolfe Pacific did not reconcile with the figure in the underlying technical annex from which it was supposedly derived. The difference was not a rounding variance or a definitional gap. A number had changed in the direction favorable to the seller. Kenneth Wolfe did not accuse anyone. He wrote a letter, 2 paragraphs, to the board of directors of Pallister Infrastructure Group, copied to general counsel on both sides, stating that Wolfe Pacific Capital was suspending all negotiations effective immediately, pending the counterparty's identification of who had approved the performance figures in the submitted proposal and confirmation of the process by which they had been validated. $900 million stopped moving in the time it takes to press send. Vincent was in a cab on the expressway when his phone rang with an Alberta area code he did not recognize. The voice introduced itself as Helen Morse, chair of the Pallister Infrastructure Board of Directors. She had not called Geoffrey Tarne first. She had called the systems analyst on administrative suspension, and she asked him one question in the careful tone of a person who already has a partial answer and wants to hear the rest from the right source. "Mr. Arlo, can you tell us exactly what happened?" The governance session convened the following afternoon. Vincent attended by video from a business center off Raffles Place, wearing the same shirt he had worn to the Wolfe Pacific meeting. 2 days earlier, his chronology printed, his folder open on the desk. Geoffrey Tarne attended from the 31st floor in Calgary with legal counsel beside him, 5 board members, the chair, and the analyst who had been prevented from entering a meeting room the previous morning. Now speaking first. He presented 6 items in sequence, without commentary or editorializing. The date he completed his technical review, the date and compliance reference number of his formal risk filing, the names of the 3 recipients and the timestamps of their read receipts, the fact that the proposal was submitted without amendment regardless, the fact that he had been dispatched to Singapore with no authority to modify any term of the agreement, and the fact that his system access had been suspended within 11 hours of Wolfe Pacific formally requesting his inclusion on the Joint Design Committee. Geoffrey Tarne's defense was competent. That was the part that was genuinely alarming. Technical concerns were routinely raised by operational staff and routinely weighed against commercial judgment. The 22% figure reflected an aspirational performance target consistent with conventions in the sector. The suspension of Vincent's credentials was a standard protective measure following an employee's unauthorized dialogue with a counterparty. Every sentence was defensible in isolation. Together, they described a company in which the warning was noise, and the person who issued the warning was the threat. Helen Morse let Geoffrey finish entirely. Then she removed her glasses and asked the question that resolved it. Mr. Tarne, if Vincent Arlo lacked the standing to speak on this transaction, why did you send him to Singapore alone to rescue it? Geoffrey began his answer and stopped. He began again. His counsel looked at the table. 19 seconds passed. In a boardroom, 19 seconds is a geological age. The decisive contribution did not come from Vincent Arlo. Kenneth Wolfe joined the call at Helen Morse's invitation and spoke for less than 90 seconds. He said he was not asking the board to take any particular personnel action. Governance of Pallister infrastructure was entirely their domain, and he had no interest in their internal politics. Then he paused briefly and finished. I will only say this. I am not in a position to place $900 million under the direction of an executive who suppressed a risk assessment his own engineer filed through his own compliance system. That is not a judgment of character. It is a judgment of my exposure. There was no confrontation. No one was escorted anywhere. The board placed Geoffrey Tarne under formal governance review. Outside counsel was engaged to examine the origin of the submitted figures. His authority over the Wolfe-Pacific relationship was stripped pending the outcome. That is what consequence looks like at that altitude, not drama. The quiet removal of the one thing a person had organized their identity around, the right to decide. Geoffrey Tarne resigned on a Wednesday in January, with a statement about pursuing other opportunities that convinced no one in the industry who knew what to look for. He left because 4 specific documented facts existed in the record. A material risk assessment had been received, and its contents excluded from board materials on his direction. Unverified performance data had been transmitted to a counterparty. A pattern of internal documentation was consistent with pre-positioning, accountability onto a subordinate in advance of an anticipated failure, and a strategic transaction representing a meaningful portion of the company's projected growth had been placed in jeopardy as a direct result. 4 lines in a report. That is all it takes when the lines are true. Helen Morse told Vincent the board wished him to lead the reconstituted technical oversight of the Wolfe-Pacific Agreement, effective immediately, with his suspension rescinded and a formal correction entered in his personnel file. He thanked her. Then he said, "Before I accept, I have 3 conditions. The first, no performance figure would appear in any proposal issued by the company without direct traceability to demonstrated operational data, with a named engineer accountable for the validation. Aspirational targets would be labeled as such in the document itself. The second, any technical employee could file a risk assessment directly to compliance, with automatic mirroring to the audit committee, and no adverse employment action could follow within 60 days without board notification." He said plainly that he had survived because he happened to know the procedure existed. The next person might not. Protection should not depend on an individual having read the governance manual at the right moment. The third condition was the one he had thought about for 3 days in a hotel room, and he stated it slowly. If senior leadership overrode a documented technical warning, leadership would own the outcome in the record, by name, permanently. The architecture of positioning operational staff to absorb the consequences of decisions made above them would be removed from the building. The board accepted all 3. There was discussion on the notification timeline in the second, and a request for drafting precision in the third. By the end of the session, all of it was in the minutes. Kenneth Wolfe was still on the call. When it concluded, he laughed and said that 12 years had passed, and Vincent Arlo was still the most inconvenient man in any room he walked into. Vincent said that was likely why he would never be asked to run a company. Kenneth was quiet for a beat, perhaps exactly why you should be. The formal investigation ran 7 weeks. What the board offered afterward, following a compensation committee review, was Senior Director of Infrastructure Systems Strategy. with direct technical authority over the Wolf Pacific build, a standing reporting line to the Audit Committee on technical risk, and an equity component. It was a real position with real scope that matched what he could actually do. He took it. The agreement was signed in Singapore 6 months later, in a boardroom 38 floors above the bay. The final structure included a committed baseline network sized to demonstrated capacity, an elastic secondary tier priced on actual utilization, mutual performance liability with genuine enforcement mechanisms, a 5-year exclusivity term tied to measurable service thresholds, and a load model rebuilt entirely from regional data with an 18-month recalibration cycle. The headline value was still above $800 million. It was simply a number the network could carry, which the previous number could not. Vincent did not relocate to Singapore. Kenneth had offered him a global role at Wolf Pacific, the kind of offer you read twice to be certain of the figures, and Vincent declined it in approximately 4 seconds. Faye had 2 years remaining in Halifax and a habit of calling on Sunday evenings, and he had already missed too many ordinary things across too many ordinary weeks by working late in a building that did not know what he had built. He told Kenneth he would run the architecture from Calgary and travel when the network needed him. Kenneth said that was the most predictable decision he had ever made, and that anything else would have been a disappointment. At the signing, Vincent Arlo sat at Kenneth Wolf's right hand, in a chair with his name printed on a small card, at the same table where 7 months earlier he had quietly distributed technical summaries at 32 seats and been advised not to misread the invitation. Pallister's new COO, a man named David Quelch, who had spent 15 years in project engineering and had read every page of the technical annex before arriving, sat across from him. That told Vincent more about where the company was going than any press release could have. After the room emptied, the two of them stood at the glass with the city arranged below, the bay going amber. In the late afternoon, the towers sharpening against the sky, the harbor traffic moving in slow, bright lines along the water. Kenneth held his coffee and said nothing for a while. Men who have earned the right to silence tend to use it well. Then he asked the same question, in nearly the same voice as the morning it had frozen a boardroom in place. "So does your COO know who you are now?" Vincent looked down at the agreement folder in his hands. The architecture page, with his signature at the bottom, the one page in $900 million of documentation that could not have been signed by anyone else in the building. He thought about a boarding pass handed over with a smile. About a man telling him not to misread an invitation. About a hotel room at 2 a.m. and an offer designed to be accepted, and about 7 words said without hesitation by a 19-year-old in Halifax who had inherited her mother's habit of going directly toward the thing that needed to be said. He smiled. Now they do.